So welcome everybody. I'm extremely excited about this session. Peter Doms and I have known each other and been friends now for some years, and probably many of you in this. I wouldn't be surprised in this session know about his work in strategic planning, and I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of how we got here and what led to this particular session. But we've been having this dialogue now for months, quite a few months, good portion of the last year, I would say. And it's been very interesting to see how we can bring sort of the power of performance thinking, our accomplishment based approach to performance, to strategic planning. So I'll let Peter say more about himself when he starts his part of the presentation. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm CEO of the Performance Thinking Network. I have a background years and years ago as trained as behavior scientist, but I've been in organizations working to help improve performance for a really long time. I realize my career is about 50 years long now, which is stunning. But I've maybe done strategic planning or facilitated it a few times, but I've observed and watched and known colleagues who have for a long time. So it's been a real treat to connect up with Peter, who is a behavior scientist by training, but who has been doing strategic planning for organizations for a long time, and we'll tell you about it. Now, you will see on this cover slide, this little thing that says similar to design for manufacturing. And as you'll see when we get going here, the way we're thinking about this is that there was a big trend, and it's just sort of the way people do business now, but in the manufacturing world way back, it was maybe in this 80s is when I became aware of it, 80s and 90s, where it was classic for people to design these incredibly cool products, engineers or whatever, and then they'd kind of throw them over the wall to the manufacturing people, and it would be extremely hard to manufacture them. And so this whole notion of design for manufacturing was, let's design the thing with the issues that would make it easier to manufacture. And so we kind of think it's that way with strategic plans, that the way the plan is designed itself can make a difference in terms of execution. So that's going to be sort of the core theme here. Before we jump into it, I would just want to tell you we're going to have a bunch more webinars, as always. We want to talk about talent development from an accomplishment-based perspective. We just want to drill down into the topic of performance improvement and why it's so hard in many organizations to shift from training to performance improvement, to do what we could describe as get out of the training box. I want to talk about implementation planning at some point. We're going to speak explicitly about servant leadership. But next month, we're really excited. Again, I'll be doing a webinar with my longtime colleague, Gina Rester-Zadro from Amgen, and on learning in the flow. And many of you who are in the learning and development world probably know that learning in the flow is kind of a buzzword or buzz phrase these days. And it means a lot of stuff to a lot of people. And sometimes it means just adopting the latest gizmos. And what's really beautiful about the approach that Gina and her community of practice at Amgen have done is they've really taken a performance-based approach to this with significant analysis up front to really figure out what that learning in the flow ought to look like. So I think it's going to be a really interesting talk, and I'm so excited about it. And I see Gina's here today too, which is wonderful. We also, of course, you can register for the webinars, and you must have already done so, but our homepage has this little thing you can click on, and it just allows you to register for them. We also, again, as many of you know, have a YouTube channel. And the easiest way to get there is just go to performancethinking.tv. All these webinars are recorded there. There's a bunch of short playlists. There's some presentations. There's a growing body of stuff that's just kind of free information about applications of performance thinking. So if you don't know about it, check it out, please. And we're really excited that after 2 years of COVID preventing us from doing it, we're going to have the Summer Institute, our 11th. And it's going to be in June. And if you register before May 1st, it's a $500 discount. And if you're a certified practitioner, there might be an additional special thing for you. But this is an exciting thing for me because it brings together a relatively small group, like 50 people roughly, of people who've been using performance thinking, some of whom have been back to the Summer Institute for 6, 7, 8, 9 years in a row. where we talk about cutting edge applications. People share the work they've been doing, often from very different companies and locations, where we try out new stuff. We're going to do some work with our new executive coaching methodology at this one. So check it out. Again, you can go to performancethinking.com and you'll find a little icon that looks like that on our little meme on the front page, and you can find out more. And before we go any further, I want to do something that I hope I finally figured out how to make this work properly. But we've got a poll here that we would like to have you fill out, and all we'd like you to do is take the description: strategic planning facilitator, executive leader owner, board member, etc., that best fits your category. We recognize a lot of people might fit into multiple categories here, but if you could identify yourself, that would be great. So we got some performance consultants and some business leaders and owners, which you might expect. Who else we got here? We got some HROD training and development people. I was like other. Ooh, we have a few strategic planning facilitators. That's great. There's a lot to be learned from Peter, I have to say. So this is actually really cool that right now, at least, I'll wait till it sort of settles out. And then supposedly when we end this, the results are supposed to show up on your screen. And I practiced this with our manager of special projects this morning, and it worked, but it doesn't always seem to work. So you're still clicking here. It looks like just about everybody's done it. Okay, so what we see before I end it is about 14% are strategic planning facilitators, about 24% are leaders, managers, owners, a couple of board members, maybe a bunch of performance consultants, and some people in HROD, and then the mysterious groups in other. Let's see if you can see this. So you're supposed to be able to see this now, the results of that. And I think I told you the results already, but this is a pretty nice mix. It's always interesting for us to see who's with us. So anyway, moving right along, thank you for doing that. One of the things we'd like to ask you to do is, we know that we usually get to the end of these sessions and we have some time for questions and answers. But a lot of times when I say, hey, got any questions? It's crickets. People don't. So we can always fill the time. But what I'd appreciate is if you have questions that come up during the course of the session, if you could leave them in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. We will like to leave them to the end because we want to manage time effectively. But please, if you got questions or comments, put them in the chat box during the session, and then we can try to address them when we get to the end. So this is roughly our agenda. I want to talk a little bit about where this came from in terms of our work at the Performance Thinking Network, and talk briefly about the problem, which is that most strategic plans are not fully executed according to authorities, and some of the issues involved there. And then I'm going to do a very, hopefully pretty brief overview about how we think performance thinking can help. And then Peter's going to talk about this because he's basically been running a lab with beginning to incorporate the things I'll be talking about into how he approaches with his clients strategic planning. And then we'll talk just a smidgen about managing execution. That's not our primary focus here. There's a lot of stuff out there about managing execution. We're talking about something that you can do, the plans themselves that will make it more executable. And then hopefully we'll have some Q&A at the end. I want to emphasize, though, that this really is work in progress. I've for a long time been interested in this area. And what we're trying to do here, and Peter's beginning to actually put it into practice, is to learn from this. And as my longtime colleague, who I can see is with us, always says at the end of his emails, we're still learning. So this is very much work in progress. Now, where this came from, I've been looking for an excuse to put this cartoon on the screen for a long time, but it's a real thing. Because when we started out the Performance Thinking Network back in the mid-10s, around 2006, 2007 is when it began to emerge, what we recognized was there was the potential, we thought, for helping to improve strategic plans and how they get played out or executed, thinking of them in a certain way as a kind of high-level performance analysis that then you would come up with recommendations and you would execute. So in a certain way, the thought was, this is another performance improvement project. It's just kind of big and starts at a very high level in an organization. Um, and so I started to seek out people in the strategic planning world. And of course, I was interested also in balanced scorecards. Some of you may know about Norton and Kaplan's work over the decades around how you define metrics and KPIs and how you have a strategy that doesn't just look at the financials, but looks at multiple dimensions of an organization. But what I kept noticing as I started to work with, especially a couple of individuals, is it really was then a miracle happens. They would do all this stuff about goals and objectives and so forth. And then I'd see their metrics and it was like, how did you come up with that? And it was like our late colleague and thought leader, Gary Rumler, used to say, it felt like it was the measures of the month club. It was like, well, how does this relate? And so, that was my initial thing, which is there's something funny here. It doesn't all hang together in the way that at least I would like it to. And so, that was around the same time as we read in the Balanced Scorecard book that 90% of organizations, according to Norton and Kaplan at that time, fail to execute their strategy successfully. That's a big number. So if we could even improve on that a little bit, that's a pretty big deal. I started poking around in preparation for this webinar, and the Strategic Thinking Institute, for example, which is one of countless websites with interesting information on it, they did some research with 400 companies that showed that more than half of them don't even have a common definition of the word strategy. And in fact, there's a section that I couldn't help but put on the screen here. The word strategy has become so bastardized, they say, that it's now combined with terms like imperatives, pillars, objectives, that many managers really have no idea what they're talking about. I thought that was a pretty stunning statement. And then we looked there's countless lists again, but we just looked at a whole bunch of places, how they define what a strategy is. So one said the intelligent allocation of resources through a unique system of activities to achieve a goal. Simply put, a strategy is how you plan to achieve a goal. Another one, a plan of action or policy designed to achieve a major overall aim. Another one, a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal, an action that managers take. So it's all about action, which makes perfect sense. Then you look up the word strategic goals. And so this is another thing that came up. I realize I don't have a citation there, but it was another website, and it said strategies have macro goals such as increased profitability, expansion, diversification, debt reduction, risk management, and so forth. And Peter will be talking more about this and why people come to him for strategic plans. But what's interesting is if you look at all these phrases, increased profitability, expansion, diversification, et cetera, they're kind of all about business results. They're really about somehow improving organizational business results, which makes perfectly good sense. As a company, as a business, we say we want to increase our revenues, we want to expand, we want to have a bigger market share, we want to reduce errors, whatever it was. So there's organizational level business results that strategic goals often include or are incorporated to. But then you poke around and see the phrase strategic objectives, which means different things to different people. On strategyhq.com says strategic objectives establish the boundaries for what your organization's effort must focus on. They create a top layer of your strategic plan's framework, et cetera. So that's interesting. And then, then you look at this list, which was just a list of strategic objectives, and notice they're all verbs. Increase internal revenue, decrease overhead spending, budget additional funds, increase stockholder, reduce, and that's verbatim right off the lists. So one of my questions is, how long do I work at increasing internal revenue? How much do I want to increase our market position to? How do I attract more sales? In other words, when is this successful? Because in the words of performance improvement, this is all about behavior or activity. I want to know what the product is. I want to know when we're there. And so, all of this stuff, and this is just a little sampling, and I suspect some of you are more familiar with this than I am, and Peter knows a lot more about it than I do, but you look out in the field of strategic planning and there's kind of a big soup. And there's some people who are really good at it and have developed a whole methodology, and there's different methodologies, and it's sort of like, what can we boil this down to? What can we distill this to some essentials that would help? And so, I just like to show this picture to some extent, but, as George Harrison borrowed from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So The real question is, with all those goals and objectives that are about doing stuff, when do you know you're done? That's the bottom line. When do we know we hit it, so to speak? And so one of the things, another list from the web was reported reasons for lack of execution. And so lack of focus, lack of energy resources, lack of understanding, and so forth. You can read them. But the ones that I found interesting, I could turn into questions, like lack of focus, like what is it we're trying to get to? What should we focus on? Or lack of energy and resources. What resources do we need, etc. So you can turn those lacks into questions that you might address in the process of planning. The ones that I found most interesting, though, are these two. First, what are we trying to accomplish? And that goes back to the same question about when do we know we're done? When do we know that the strategy was successful? We can increase revenue, but to what? We can, whatever it is. And then how can we monitor progress, which seems quite tied up to that one. Now, those of you who know performance thinking or know about our models know that one of our models, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, is the 6 boxes model. And box 1 is expectations and feedback. And what we've seen over decades, and probably everybody here has too, if you haven't thought about it, and if you have thought about it, I'm sure you've seen this, is that most of the problems and difficulties that we see in performance, whether it's organizational or individual, are related to fuzzy, conflicting, or lack of clear expectations. Because if I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing and producing, how do I know what resources and tools I even need? Or if people, any of the rest of it depends on what we're trying to accomplish. So we think expectations are paramount, and that's where we think we might be able to help with strategic plans. So let me talk very quickly about how we think our models and our way of thinking about performance can help. And then, as I said, Peter will take over and really show us some work and sort of how this plays out in his initial work on this. So the first thing is, those of you who don't know about performance thinking, I'm going to tell you, and those who do have probably seen this slide a whole bunch of times. But we consider our approach to continuous performance improvement to be somewhat different than a lot of others. It is without a doubt the same as many others in that it involves analyzing and communicating about human performance in ways that are actionable and evidence-based. But what we've done over a period of years, and we really kind of crystallized this maybe 12, 15 years ago, and then we've been teaching people how to use it since then, is that we have these 2 simple visual models, or mental models, some people would call them, and plain English language. We always like to say that performance thinking is built on 2 simple pictures and 21 plain English words. And I will show you those 2 things soon. But the thing about that is, once you have that shared, simple, straightforward visual and verbal vocabulary, it means that anybody at any level or function can use this, and we've definitely shown that, from executives down to frontline workers on the assembly line and everybody in between, that you can build communities of shared practice because they have a common language, and you can drive collaboration and continuous improvement. Now, back when we started teaching this to people, there's a whole bunch of people who said, you're giving us models and methods and tools, but really what you're doing is teaching us to think differently about performance through the kind of lens or the filter of these 2 models. And so we adopted that term and eventually trademarked it and renamed our company after it. This is what performance thinking is. And I want to just show you at a very high level some of the key elements that we think affect how you would do strategic plans. So the first thing is, the sort of ground level is Tom Gilbert, who many of you either knew personally or know about as a thought leader, who's no longer with us, but he published a book in 1978 that's still out there, still being studied in graduate schools. We celebrated with his still living wife and partner, Marilyn Gilbert, 40 years of publication of this 3 years ago now, or 4 years ago. But one of the things that Tom was known about was a focus on accomplishments. And I always like to quote this thing because Tom was an iconoclast. And this was very kind of a little bit of poke in the eye, the way he said, in the great cult of behavior. And what he meant by that was not behavior scientists or anybody. He meant leaders, managers, trainers. He meant kind of everybody that's about trying to help people do better. In the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. but we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, people who know this work know that he talked about behavior is costly, accomplishments are what are valuable. You can think about return on investment as how much do you increase the accomplishments of people, at what cost. But in any case, the word accomplishments was a game changer and really one of the fundamentals in a big part of the field of human performance improvement or human performance technology. Now, we coined the phrase work outputs instead, and you'll see that from here on out. Because if you look up the word accomplishments, it's a wonderful marketing word. It's compelling. It sounds like it's valuable. But most of the dictionary definitions have to do with behavior or the completion of behavior. And if you look out in the field of supposed performance improvement, accomplishments mean to some people everything from big old business results to changes in behavior to it's fuzzy. And not being somebody who likes fuzziness, we coined the phrase work outputs, and that's what we mean. We mean accomplishments when we say that. Now, if you take that into account, then how would you define organizational performance? And we would say that it has three elements. That human performance is behavior that produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to business results. Now, I'm going to show the soccer girl that Gina Restrezzadro is quite familiar with, and many of you are. But this young lady is, if it was animated, you see she's behaving. She's kicking the ball. So that's the behavior part. And what she's trying to do is she either directly or through somebody else that she kicks it to, trying to get a work output, which is a goal, a ball in the net. It's well-defined. It's a thing. You can count them. And if you count enough of them, you'll win. You'll get organizational and business results. So we love sports models because it's pretty darn accurate if you think about performance. And what we say is that behavior is an action. We describe it with verbs. Work outputs are things, and we, in Performance Thinking Network, insist that they be countable things. They're countable nouns. And when we talk about business results, we're always talking about overall success factors for the whole organization, even though we recognize there are things, intermediate business results as well. We're emphasizing how do we look at the whole company and see what results it needs to achieve. So that's kind of not really a metaphor, it's an example, but that leads to our first model, which is the performance chain. And we analyze from, with the end in mind. We say, okay, what are the business results or organizational results that are at stake here? And then once we know that, we say, okay, now what do people, processes, and teams have to produce, the work outputs? And you can see the list below that. There are different types of work outputs, some of them very concrete, like deliverables, or widgets, for example, but some of them less concrete, like decisions or milestones in a process or relationships. But those are all countable nouns that we can define. And once we know what those are, the beauty of it is we can then figure out what the behavior is that's required to produce them. We can even identify exemplary behavior, and then we can figure out what behavior influences need to be put in place. Now, work outputs is the spine of this thing. It's the anchor. It's whatever metaphor you want to use. And you might notice on this slide, we also say criteria for good, because we don't just want to have any old proposal or any old relationship or any old widget. We want to have an output that meets standards that make it good, that make it okay, that make it one that we're going to use and pass on and what we value. So we emphasize defining work outputs and then defining what a good one is, so everybody's clear about it. Now, the thing is, a more common way of thinking that most people don't think about accomplishments in the way that I've just been speaking. And if you consider the way most strategic planning happens, it looks kind of like this. They say, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff, and it's going to increase those business results. So somehow the strategic plan is supposed to kind of fit in there. But we don't buy that. We think that work outputs are critical, and we think that this is the way that we connect up people's behavior to business results. In order to achieve a business result, you got to have so many customers, you got to have so many contracts, you got to have so many appointments with people, a whole bunch of stuff. In order to produce a widget, there's a bunch of things that lead to that widget. And so work outputs and criteria that define good ones, we think, are the critical link, really, from behavior to business results. And again, the criteria thing is really important, because you can have a lousy proposal or a terrible relationship or not a very successful transaction. We need to know what a good one is. Just touching lightly on this, We think if you're looking for measures or key performance indicators, that the performance chain is a very nice guide, because business results are usually organizational business results. It's important to monitor them. Most companies and executives are revenue, profit, membership, if it's a membership organization, market share, etc. But they're lagging indicators. You usually don't get those data very often, and so you can't make frequent decisions about what's working and what's not. So it's important, but they're lagging indicators. Measuring behavior, and I know there's a bunch of behaviorists in this group, is very important. Particularly if you're trying to diagnose while you're not getting the outputs you want, or if you're trying to provide people feedback to help improve their behavior in some way. But it's kind of costly to do. It's hard and expensive to watch behavior all the time. And sometimes, like in safety environments or behavioral health environments, you need to pay quite a lot of attention to that, but it's expensive. But work outputs very often are products that you can count. And if you define what a good one is, you've got an opportunity to have a leading indicator that you can make a lot of decisions about. So we teach people how to measure, but we emphasize work outputs if possible, because it's usually an easier way to get a good leading indicator to make frequent decisions. And we're not going to talk about this, but once you start to execute whatever your performance plan or whatever your intervention is, we, of course, have an integrated model of behavior influences, which we mentioned. It's the 6 boxes model. It's a plain English descendant of Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model. And what we say is, either from a behavior science point of view or from a very practical point of view, there is nothing that affects human behavior that can't be sorted into these cells or relationships between them. And we're not going to spend time on this right now, but if you think about executing a plan of any kind, you need to have this stuff in place with respect to the people who execute it and the teams and the processes and so forth. So, and in fact, we can even drill deeper. In our leadership and management work, we talk about how effective leaders and managers basically arrange, configure, and manage all those behavior influences. And this is a list of some best practices by leaders and managers sorted in. But again, you can think about it, if you go back to our core topic here, strategic planning, you recognize that once you start to execute a strategic plan, you got to have leaders and managers arranging conditions so people can do whatever it is that they need to do to achieve the milestones on the way to the final goals. So here's the thought process, and I'm almost done here. We call this performance improvement logic, and I've already sort of mentioned it. But what we say is, if you put these two models together, where the 6 boxes model is the way we sort of make sense of behavior influences. We start with the end in mind. We understand what the business results are that a project or a situation or a plan is about, what's at stake, in other words. We then look at the individuals, teams, processes to see what the work outputs are and be sure they're connected to or contribute to one or more business results. And then we say, okay, now let's take a look at behavior. We can do task analysis. We can observe successful performers. We can identify exemplary behavior. But we know what the behavior is supposed to be doing. It's supposed to be producing those work outputs. And once we've done that analysis, now we're in pretty good shape to select measures following the guideline I mentioned earlier. We can measure some combination of those things based on convenience and accessibility and how often we can get the data. And then we look at the behavior influences and we do some analysis of what's in place. We brainstorm possible improvements. We choose and configure some set of interventions. And then we implement, measure, and adjust in an agile, continuous improvement way. So that's the core logic that we teach everybody in performance thinking. And we think this logic can be applied to strategic planning. So there are basically 3 ways that we think, or 3 ideas from what I've just said, that Peter's going to play out for us, where we think this can help us make plans more executable. The first thing is, instead of just having a lot of activities described as tactics and strategies, actually have work outputs or accomplishments at every level. Big ones like maybe the establishment of a new department even, or a new division, all the way down to small ones like, creating a new form that allows us to draw in customers more, whatever it is. Whether it's at the sort of highest level of objectives or at the most micro level of milestones in a rollout plan, define those accomplishments. And then add criteria so everybody's pretty clear what a good one is. So we're not in conflict about that. So it's not open to interpretation. And then use those major work outputs that start at the high end of the strategic plan to cascade down to milestones in a fairly conventional project planning approach. So these are ways we think that if we build this way of thinking into strategic planning, it can make a difference. And so Peter's going to show us, how that plays out. And let me turn it over to Peter. I'm going to stop my slides, and he's going to appear. So, and just a second here. Stop presentation. So go for it, Peter.
Thank you, Carl. I appreciate that. Let me find my slides right here. That was a great introduction. I appreciate that. And oops, some of the slides are not showing up.
If you just click on, if you go up to the top, say start presentation.
I did.
And then at the bottom.
I can see them at the top, but they don't show up on the screen.
Oh, really? Okay. At the bottom, there should be a thing which says start. There it goes. You got it. So
as Carl mentioned, I've been doing strategic planning for a while now, over 20 years. I got my PhD in applied behavior analysis from Western Michigan University, and pretty much was focused on systems thinking. And I was working with Dale Breathauer, some of you may know that name, and doing a practicum while working my dissertation. I worked for county government, and one of the things that we did there, we wrote a manual for strategic planning. And once I got out of school, I realized and was done with the county. I realized that's something that I really like to do, because to me, strategic planning is the systems analysis application at the highest possible level. Because if you get the strategic plans wrong, things go wrong for the entire organization. So, and I enjoy the work very much, and I enjoy learning with organizations. And what I bring to the table is a process that brings people from creating guiding principles all the way to having a completed strategic plan ready for execution. So this USA Today snapshot from 2004 asks the question, what management issue do you consistently spend the most time on? And a whopping 39% of managers and executives said that they spend their time on strategic thinking and planning. And I believe that this number probably has not decreased, but might have increased with the fast-moving environment in which businesses operate. So we figured that this is also a topic that is of interest to you, to learn about strategic planning and how you can channel your strategic thinking in a productive way. So we talked about definitions for strategies, and so we want to define strategic planning. It's a process that adds value to the organization's products and services, that sets the organization apart from competitors. So that's the planning is the process. And that's how we're going to approach it throughout the next set of slides here. So what is strategic planning not? So I tell my clients that strategic planning is forward thinking, but everything that you do has to be rooted in reality. So your vision, your goals, your objectives should be things that you can either control or you have very strong influence over for the plan to be successful. And there are many reasons for strategic planning, and these are all reasons I've heard from clients. Some have to do with organizational health, get agreement and alignment on priorities on the steering team or the leadership team, improve the competitive advantage, create compelling mission, vision, and values, and others. You can read those, reducing turnovers. There's also other reasons include improving client outcomes, create operational efficiencies, operational excellence with respect to services as well, and improve communication. And another group of reasons for strategic planning have to do with the financial success of a business, whether it's to do with revenue diversity, growing the business, selling it. I even worked with an owner who wanted to spend less time on the business, but more time doing fun stuff like teaching and research. So all these are reasons for strategic planning. And even though clients come to me with 2 or 3 perhaps challenges that they are facing or 4, often in the strategic planning process, we can cover a whole lot more than just the few they had at the onset. So how does a strategic plan help in a business? First of all, a strategic plan provides a business with a roadmap for moving toward the future. And the roadmap is a cliche we have heard a lot, but it is really true. It's a map for guiding organization toward their vision. And for this reason, the creation of a plan is as important as its execution. So that's why we're focusing on making strategic plans more executable as the topic for our talk. So when I tell also my client, it's very important that when we create a plan, that during the planning process itself, a lot of things will be addressed, like getting buy-in for priorities, established priorities, and things that all will then flow into the strategic plan. So Carl talked a lot about work outputs, and I want to show you how planning and execution processes link to work outputs. So this is the process that I'm using. There's other people who may use different processes. What I call pre-planning or during a kickoff meeting. Our deliverables, our work outputs, are agreements and decisions about who should participate. What does the agenda look like? What is it that we want to get out at the end? Where do we have our planning sessions? And what's the overall timeline for the process? So those are agreements that we have to be aligned on to move forward. And then the second piece in the process is what we call strategy development. That is typically done at offsite sessions or planning retreats. And the outcomes there, the outputs are descriptions of mission, vision, the values, trends and impacts, SWOT analysis. We look at gaps and barriers, and then based on those, draft objectives. So those are all the tangible outputs that we capture mostly on flip charts, unless we do this virtually. Next, we have strategy formulation. This is actually writing the plan. So in offsite sessions, I've had up to 30 people, more common is less than 20, develop the strategy. But what we then do with a smaller group, we actually write the plan. We then write the introduction, the guiding principles. We take the goals and objectives that have been kind of brainstormed and drafted at the strategy development phase, and we finalize those and make sure that they point to tangible results. We add target dates and owners as well as metrics. And then finally, we have strategy execution. So also there are work outputs. So the execution documents include a rollout plan. So how can we make sure that the strategies roll out efficiently and effectively throughout the organization? We have monthly and quarterly updates, adjusted strategies, tracking updates, annual refreshers. All those are work outputs. And so at each phase of the strategic planning process, we're focusing on creating outputs. But there's still the execution problem. Tony Hayward, the CEO of BP, said in 2007, our problem is not about the strategy itself, but about our execution of it. And that's the number where that Carl referenced, that 90% of the plans do not get executed fully. So what can we do with user performance thinking to make the plans easier to execute? Well, there's different things that can be done. First of all, identify work outputs or accomplishments that the organization needs to produce at every level. I showed you those earlier. Secondly, add criteria for good so that we know when those work outputs or accomplishments are complete. That means what we do is we get from kind of fuzzy to more crisp strategies and objectives. Finally, use the major work outputs or accomplishments in the plan to anchor execution through project planning with milestones, because in the plan now we have clear work outputs defined that then can be executed against during the implementation phase. This is a page out of a strategic plan that we just created for an airport just last year. And as you can see, goal number 3 is the airport property is fully utilized. That's linked to some overall business results. That was important to the airport to just get more land that they can be developed. And then we list strategic objectives, which are major outputs, the numbered items, and then the items with the letters are tactics as behaviors, or there are sub-outputs that help accomplish a strategic objective. So if you look down the list, there is an advertising plan, there's a release process. Number 3 is a decision. All these are work outputs. Again, number 4 is a development plan that includes financing. So all these are clear work outputs. And then the lettered items are the tactics that could either be a behavior, like step number 1, obtain FAA determination. But even in the behavior, we try to make sure that we specify the output that's sought. For example, items 4A and B, very simple. Develop a map. But we know what we want to develop. It's very clearly that we know that the map is the work output for this particular tactic. And to make the plan also executable, I've seen strategic plans that just stop with this. They have a list of objectives, maybe some tactics, and then that's it, underneath some goal. However, as behavior analysts, we know that we need other items to set expectations, like in box 1. So we also add target completion date, as we call it, by when does something need to be completed. And then who is the owner? Who is in charge of a particular objective? The owner can work with a team or committee or with other colleagues. It's not the person doing all the work, but make sure that his strategy is moving forward. So we identify those items as well. And then there's a resource column in case we need to identify items that have to do with budgeting. But without target dates and owners, you can imagine that objectives end up on the back burner very, very quickly because there's other fires to be put out that then make the strategic plan less of a priority. So this in the strategy execution phase. So now once we have developed the plan and we have formulated the writing, we also use criteria for good and milestones. Let me just walk you through a process, also an example from the airport. So a typical objective is behavior-based. In this case, it was explore cross-runway options. And those are objectives that people generate ideas for during the offsite. And it's not really my goal to just really nail them down and say, what is this the accomplishment? We know it's cross-runway options, so I know I can work with it. The goal for the offsite is to generate as many ideas as possible. Then when we take the plan with a smaller group, we look at what is it really that we need to accomplish. And in this case, the work output is a decision to build or not to build a cross-runway. So the decision is our work output that will be ended up in the strategic plan as an objective underneath the goal. Then during the strategy execution, whoever the owner is works with a team. And the first thing they will do, have to sit down and identify the criteria for good. So for the decision. So what does it include? In this case, it could include airport director supports consultants' recommendations. Another criteria for a good decision is that it's approved by a supermajority of the aeronautics board, and the ROI has to be within an agreed upon time frame. So these criteria have to be met for the decision to be considered a good decision. And then once those are in place, we create the milestone. Oops, what happened here? I see just a blue screen over my stuff. There it is. I'm sorry. Go back. So the milestones could be, consultant hire, runway requirements, and other things that go into this kind of process. And look at the last output. The last milestone is a decision. So, and we already define what the decision has to look like in order to be a good decision. And then also the team will identify the metrics or the KPIs. We have leading indicators. In this case, the milestones or the sub-outputs are on track. The lagging indicator depends really what the outcome might be. With the decision, we don't really have as much of a lagging indicator. If they decide to build a runway, that would be a different plan altogether. That would have lagging indicators as well with respect to revenue, cost, and so on. So to summarize, to get from planning to execution, the key is to produce work outputs. Starting out in the development phase by identifying the mission, vision, and the values. So the guiding principles, those are the hierarchical guiding statements that help set the framework for the strategic planning. The vision sets the framework for the future and developing goals, so that I tell my clients it's really critical to align the goals with the vision so that the vision will be the North Star, so to speak, in achieving the desired results for the organization. Then during strategy formulation, the writing of the strategic plan, the strategic goals typically refer to business results. So in this case, we have goal number 2. And then in the writing of the plan, we refine the strategic objectives to be work outputs, like you've seen in the example we had earlier. So we might refine what comes out of the overall session with a number of people during the retreats. And then when we hand it over for strategy execution, the first product that has to be produced, the work output, is the criteria for good. And then based on that, a project plan will be developed to identify what are the milestones that have to be accomplished in order to achieve the strategic objective in a way that it meets the criteria for good. And then so the project plan is executed. And at the end of the execution, then you have an accomplished strategy and strategic objective. So in this case, the goal has 4 objectives. When those are complete, that may mean that you have accomplished the goal. But what I find a lot is that during strategy execution, there's things that may have been overlooked or wasn't even thought about during strategy development because you have not gotten as far into the issue or the topic at hand. So it's very, very typical that objectives will be added once you get into the execution process and have been in it for a while. So once you have a plan, what do you do next? So once you have a plan, monitor progress and accomplishments. That's really critical. And identify and bust barriers. That's really points really to the behavior influences that might keep teams or the owners from accomplishing strategic objectives. So they will be brainstormed with the leadership team or the project team to make sure that those behavior influences negative ones can be turned away, and that we have more positive ones. Adjust objectives and target dates as needed, and celebrate success. And that is really critical. I work with many organizations where people are just used to achieving milestones that they don't even celebrate, but it's really critical to do that. And so where can that happen? I read a statistic that said that 86% of business owners and leaders do not spend more than 1 hour a month on strategic planning and on the discussing strategy. So when you have regular leadership meetings, there may be some urgent barriers that have to be busted. There may be, I recommend monthly strategy reviews. There's a meeting dedicated just for strategy and strategy execution. And then after you go through it for about a year, I recommend an annual refresher where you look at the activities that you conducted during the initial planning phase and see what has changed. There may be strategic objectives that have been completed that can be then coming off the plan. New ones can be put in. Maybe there's time for another SWOT analysis, for example. So it's important that once you have your plan and you do the execution, that you spend time on the strategy and not just put the strategic plan on the shelf. And we feel if you make the plan more executable, they will not end up on the shelf. Here's just an example of how to track progress. This is from a behavioral health organization. This is very simple for organizations that don't have complicated or dedicated software for tracking the execution. So in the left column there, you see strategic objectives for each goal. We have a goal there, and then all the objectives list work outputs: a decision, a formal internship program, a roadmap, employment services, assessments, and so on. And it has dates and owners. And then during the strategy update, this document can be posted on a shared service like Teams, or maybe some people use Google Docs or something else. And then in the column that's labeled F, new update, that's where the latest update will be put in. So we can always see what has been accomplished or what is being in progress, and then the new update, and then the previous update moves to the right side. So that's just one simple way of tracking progress that everybody can follow, and that then can be used for the monthly strategy review meetings. There are also project management applications that are targeting project management, but also strategy implementation. These are 4 that clients of mine use. I'm not necessarily very familiar with each of those since I don't have hands-on experience, but Those are out there to be explored and that help with strategy implementation. So finally, some takeaways. So performance thinking drives an accomplishment-based approach to strategic planning. And as Carl pointed out, the definitions that we found typically describe strategy as a series of activities. And then goals are expressed as organizational improvements, and they line up with the model as business results. Objectives are defined as countable products of behavior. That is the key. So they're work outputs. And work outputs should always have criteria for good to define completion, just like we saw in the example where it talked about a cross-runway decision. There has to be determined what makes a good decision, so we know that we have arrived at the end of that strategy objective. Tactics are activities at different levels of detail. In this case, behavior. Sometimes tactics can also be listed as sub-outputs. And then the project plans that are being created during the implementation phase, during the execution phase, they have steps with milestones. And so when those milestones are completed, then the objective is completed as well. So that was my last slide. I'm going to turn it over to Carl. He has a few more things to say. So we can hear you.
Oh, hold on. Sorry, I had my audio off. Thank you, Peter. For me, what you just said is crystal clear, and it's such a contrast. Your slides are really nice too, but I mean, it's just, there's a process that you go through, and it's anchored to accomplishment. So I really appreciate that, the clarity of it. It's interesting because we work together on this, but just sitting back and watching as an audience member, it's just, to me, really clear. And I wonder what. I haven't seen any questions at this point. There's a couple of questions about whether the presentation will be sent out. We don't share the slides, but there'll be a link to the recording of this that you will get in an email within probably by the day after tomorrow. And then also eventually it will be posted on our YouTube channel. But I wonder if, I've got lots of things I could ask Peter, but I'm curious, can we get some comments or questions from you all? What do you think? You still with us? Uh-huh. Okay.
Well, a lot of information at once, Carl, so people may have to think about it for a minute.
That's true. Well, there's a few very experienced performance thinking folks in this group. And, from a certain point of view, this is not rocket science, right? Yeah, Bob, fair enough. He's one of them. Bob's one of the masters of this work. It's pretty straightforward. So notice the question, does this work in an agile environment? My answer would probably be yes, but what would you say to that, Peter?
Absolutely. If you make sure that we call the strategic plan a living document. So it's really key that you do not think that the strategic plan is a document that's cast in stone, but rather that you review fairly often. That's why we talk about a monthly review. And if things come up in the environment, you can change and adjust the strategies. And one of the questions I get, or some of the, concerns that clients have is, can we change dates? Can we change objectives once we have the plan, or do we just execute right against what we initially thought? And all my plans have a caveat in there that the implementation schedule is flexible and can be adjusted based on budget conditions, based on changes in the organizational environment. So absolutely, as long as you stay on top of the plan, I think it can be used for an agile environment.
So there's another comment I would say there too, which is if you step back to performance thinking as a methodology, you may remember when I laid out the logic, the last step is, implement, measure, and change as needed. We've partly because both of us actually trace back to the origins in behavior science, and Skinner's behavior science was about continue to adjust things until you can essentially predict outcomes, or predict and control behavior, as he would have said. But it's interesting because there's a lot of people in the training and development performance improvement world that sort of come up with their interventions and they roll it out and then they go to the next one. I was having a great conversation. I've actually had a lot of great conversations with Gina Resterzadeh, who I think is still with us. And one of the things that she has brought into practice in her community of practice in any performance improvement effort, and I would say it applies just as well to strategic planning, is you go back and check. And so one of the nice things about what you laid out, Peter, is saying, no, you don't just, we're done. You do these meetings you were talking about, you check, you monitor, you make adjustments. So I guess from my point of view is it's dead if it's not thought of as an agile thing. So there's some other stuff. Somebody said who owns, I think Roger Addison said, who's the owner of success? So I'm not sure what that means exactly.
Probably the owner of the objectives. Those will be determined by the leadership team and typically are at the higher level in the organization who own the objective and who make sure that it gets implemented. That also means they can delegate and drive it deeper down into the organization. I see a question there if this anyone applied this specifically to an autism client's case itself. I don't know. I work with autism service providers, but I don't know if anybody ever used the strategic planning process like this to a client's case. But of course, you start out by identifying the parent's vision and what the goals are, and then you execute against those goals and make sure that you have milestones as well in the behavior plans. How do you differentiate mission from vision? A mission, that's a good question. A mission is really about the purpose of the organization, what the organization does, why it exists, in other words. What do we do? And the key component there is what are the benefits the organization is providing to its clients or customers. A vision is more about what the organization wants to become or what the organization sees its client becoming based on the changes that they're making in the strategic planning process and in the execution.
Bob's question is a good one too about small businesses. Bob Redeker, do you see that one in our client?
Yeah, I see that, and I see a question that's similar from Len Levin as well. So how small businesses, absolutely. I work with small organizations, large organizations. I work with the university at the leadership level, colleges. I work for organizations within corporations like global research functions to develop this process. I also work with small nonprofits. I had nonprofits with one staff person, but with a large board. So we did strategic planning there.
So, Peter, I think the second half of what Bob said is interesting because you and I have talked about this. He says anything you find unique for smaller organizations. And I think you've talked about sort of how the work and how the execution happens in terms of who's responsible and stuff. But I'm not sure how you would respond.
So what I would say, Bob, is that that in that size organization that all the owners are typically sit on the leadership team or the next level down as the directors or managers. That's pretty much the only difference that I would say from larger clients that I had. If you have large organizations that has maybe an overarching strategic plan, it could well be that you then want to make sure that your organization's plan for the department or the function lines up with the strategic goals and the mission vision of the overall organization.
Mm-hmm. Len's comment or question is interesting. He says the obstacle I came across most frequently is the need to identify the end result clearly and then work backwards. Many managers want to jump in with preferred strategies, et cetera. That's just like performance improvement. In fact, again, Bob Redeker is here. One of the phrases that I've always associated with you, Bob, is being solution neutral in performance improvement. And I think you have to work backwards in terms of the goals and the objectives. Yes. And then the beauty of I think of defining those objectives as outputs is you can pretty well, once you describe a strategy as an activity, you can at least make a reasonably good hunch about, does that look like it's going to produce this thing at the end? But I don't know, what's your experience with that been, Peter, in terms of people wanting to just go for the strategy before they really get the big picture?
Well, that is true. What I find, though, is that when we do strategic planning and we have the offsites, and then people try to get into the very granular items sometimes because they understand those. But I try to pull them back and say, what are some bigger picture items that we need to accomplish to fill certain gaps or challenges? And then we capture those anyway, even if those are like technical ideas, because they later on can inform the writing of the strategic plan.
Mm-hmm. There's some great just comments based on experience here. What else? Any other stuff you can respond to there, Peter?
Nancy talks about a 40K corporation. I never worked with an organization that was that large. Typically small organizations.
When you say 40K, do you mean 40,000 people? Is that what I'm not sure
what I understand it to mean.
Yeah.
Don Gibson's approach. I often ask clients to see their previous plans. Usually they have to think about where it is. Strategic plan should be an ongoing goal. Don, you're absolutely right. Yes, that is so true. And I see that as well with respect to the mission and vision. Do you have a mission and vision? Yes, but we don't know what it is. It may be on a website or maybe developed by somebody in the past or was developed by an owner. So one of the things that I find with the approach that I'm taking is that clients do execute the plans. We do quarterly reviews with some of them or do checkups later on, and people are executing. And they may say, well, we're not quite on track where we wanted to be, but that's why target dates can be adjusted because things happen in organizations. It may be hard to hire staff. COVID was a big detractor, even though we had some clients who said that having had a strategic plan and were in the process of executing has helped them to have stronger systems in place that help them to weather the storm with respect to the COVID regulation, the COVID impact on the organization.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting. The Norton and Kaplan, who were the original, there's balanced scorecard guys, and who were the ones that I quoted about 90% of plans are never fully executed. Their solution recommendation is an OSM, Office of Strategic Management, which would clearly apply in a big company. You know, they have some. They recommend having a group to keep everybody honest is one way to think about it and on track, and who knows where the plan is, and know where the vision statement is, and who follows it up. But I think even if you just bring it down to the level of a few people getting together in the kind of process that you've described, Peter, which is, like you said, checkups, reviews, monitoring, decisions, as long as somebody, and maybe it's you as an external consultant, keeps people doing that so it doesn't fall off their to-do list, it seems more likely to be executed. So at least you'll eliminate those ones where people put the strategy in the drawer and forget about it. But then the question is, and this is where I think you've added value big time, is if the objectives and the milestones are defined well enough so you know you've accomplished them or not, it's a lot easier for people to actually do that monitoring and see whether they produced it or not. And I think that's a big deal.
One of the things I found too is that depending how long the strategic planning process draws out and how many people are engaged is whether this plan ends up on the shelf or in a drawer. Universities are known for that, to have 40, 50-page strategic plans that took 40 people 6 months to create. And then at the end, everybody is happy that it's done and nobody wants to be bothered with it anymore afterwards. Exactly right. That's right.
So I think I'm noticing the time, and I don't want to keep people, but I wanted to have a couple more slides here just to, and then to give you contact information so you can be in touch with Peter or me if you want to. First thing is, there's a lot of ways to learn to do performance thinking. There's a lot of free resources that I've already mentioned at our performancethinking.com has a resource library, and it has programs, and then the YouTube channel has a ton of stuff, and the LinkedIn group. Sometimes there's very interesting conversations. We've got a practitioner program coming up March 17th. It's open. Anybody can sign up for it. We like to talk to people first, but you can find out about that at our website, performancethinking.com or sixboxes.com. And then Shane Isley is going to be doing a delivery, an open program of our performance coaching program for people in the applied behavior analysis world, either for clinical supervisors or for new managers. So those are two things to know about. And then, of course, I already mentioned our Summer Institute. Please check it out. It's a wonderful experience. And there's actually on our YouTube channel, there's a few video. In fact, a couple people, Scott, I see is in the group here. There's a couple of people on video talking about it. And then finally, here's our contact information. If you want to get in touch with Peter, there's his website and his email address, and mine as well. So I think this is probably it. Thank you so much, everybody.
Carl, thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been a fun collaboration. It will continue. We're still learning, as Roger would say. So thank you, everybody. I think we're done.